We're ashamed of you." Those were the words my daughter-in-law chose to say at Christmas dinner, with a smile on her face and a room full of witnesses. For a moment, the entire table went silent. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire in the living room and the soft Christmas music drifting from a speaker near the tree. I looked around the dining room, expecting someone to laugh nervously and call it a joke. No one did. Rachel sat comfortably in her chair, holding a wine glass between perfectly manicured fingers. My son, Wade, stared down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. That was the moment I realized this conversation had been rehearsed long before I arrived. I'm Emily Harper, 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that evening, I believed I still had a place in my family. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday. Even after my husband, Robert, passed away 4 years earlier, I continued hosting family traditions. I baked the same pecan pies he loved. I hung the same stockings. I wrapped gifts with the same careful attention I had shown for decades. I believed traditions mattered because they reminded people who loved them. That morning, I had spent nearly 6 hours preparing side dishes and desserts before driving 30 minutes through light snowfall to Wade and Rachel's house. I carried containers of homemade food into their kitchen while Rachel barely looked up from her phone. At the time, I told myself she was simply busy. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention. The signs had been there for months. Family gatherings had become shorter. Phone calls had become less frequent. Invitations arrived later and later, sometimes only a day before the event. Every change seemed small on its own. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. As everyone settled around the beautifully decorated dining table that evening, I tried to ignore the strange feeling in my chest. The room looked perfect. White candles glowed softly. Red ribbons wrapped around the backs of chairs. Through the large front window, snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights. It should have felt warm. Instead, it felt like standing outside in the cold. Halfway through dinner, Rachel set down her fork and exchanged a glance with Wade. Then she turned toward me. "Honestly, Emily," she said, "we're ashamed of you." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed. Nobody spoke. I waited for Wade to interrupt. He didn't. Rachel continued smiling as though she had complimented the weather. I felt my heart pounding, but I refused to give her the reaction she wanted. So I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened. Because when someone finally decides to show you who they are, the smartest thing you can do is pay attention. And as I sat beneath the glow of Christmas lights that night, I began noticing things I had overlooked for far too long. After Rachel spoke, the room felt heavier than the snow outside. I did not respond immediately. I placed my fork gently on my plate and stared at the centerpiece, a simple arrangement of pine cones and candles, noticing how the flickering light cast shadows across the polished wooden table. Wade shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly, but he did not speak up for me. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the same one I had felt during the subtle dismissals over the past few months, when invitations arrived late or when my calls went unanswered for days. The meal continued, voices and laughter attempting to fill the space Rachel had cut with her words, yet everything sounded distant, almost muffled. I watched her carefully, noting the calculated way she interacted with the guests, the pauses, the slight tilt of her head, the subtle curl of her lips when she delivered a remark that could pass as casual, but to me carried the weight of condescension. I reminded myself to breathe, to remain composed. I silently observed Wade as he spoke to a cousin across the table, catching the glances he threw in her direction, brief flickers of hesitation that he quickly masked with a polite nod. My mind wandered to the Christmases past, when the children were young and Robert would sing carols off-key, laughing while we all joined in, our home filled with warmth and genuine cheer. Those memories contrasted sharply with the quiet tension of this night. I set my hands on my lap, feeling the smooth linen of my dress against my skin, and let my eyes drift to the fireplace where stockings hung, empty this year of little surprises and handmade trinkets from eager hands. Every detail seemed amplified in that moment. The smell of roasted turkey, the shine of ornaments, the soft glow of the lights, and yet, none of it brought comfort. I remembered the years I spent preparing family dinners, the effort to ensure everyone felt seen and cared for, and I compared it with the careful, almost strategic positioning of Rachel and Wade tonight. I thought of small signs I had ignored. The way the invitations to holiday gatherings gradually shortened, the way phone calls were brushed off, the subtle redirection of conversations away from me, and the way Rachel smiled when she corrected someone who addressed me with familiarity, claiming it was for clarity. It all accumulated quietly over time, creating a sense of isolation that became undeniable. I took a slow sip of water, feeling the coolness against my throat, and reminded myself that silence can be powerful. I observed the tiny shifts at the table, a folded napkin here, a hand brushing crumbs there, a glance exchanged with precision, all unnoticed by others but clear to me. I felt the weight of being deliberately overlooked, and instead of anger, a calm clarity settled within me. I realized that every slight, every word and gesture designed to undermine my presence had made me more attentive, more aware of the dynamics of my family. I began forming thoughts about small, deliberate responses, ways to reclaim dignity without confrontation, ways to shift the perception of weakness that Rachel seemed so intent on projecting. The dinner wound on, a mix of forced cheer and private whispers, and I allowed myself to remain present, quietly cataloging each detail, each reaction, storing them for later use. Beneath the glow of the Christmas tree, with its lights twinkling softly against the ceiling, I felt a subtle power returning, a sense that although this night had been carefully orchestrated to humiliate, it had also revealed the truth in a way that would guide my next steps. The realization settled in that observing carefully, maintaining composure, and allowing Rachel and Wade to underestimate me could become my quiet advantage, and with that thought, I exhaled slowly, a single, steady breath, as I watched them unaware, believing the evening had gone according to their design, while I silently prepared for the moments to come. After the dinner, I excused myself quietly from the table, carrying my plate to the kitchen while Rachel continued to converse with the guests, her laughter punctuating the air like tiny bells that sounded sharp against the soft hum of the evening. I set the plate down on the counter, noting how the reflection of the Christmas lights shimmered against the polished surface, creating 1,000 tiny points of color that felt almost like a distraction from the weight settling in my chest. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window, watching snow fall steadily on the quiet street outside, the flakes settling gently on the evergreen bushes, covering them in a soft white blanket. The house was filled with sounds of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the occasional rustle of wrapping paper, yet I felt separated from all of it, a silent observer in a room full of people who pretended not to notice me. I thought about Wade, about how he had always been attentive to family traditions, the way he would set the table for Robert and me on holidays, the care in which he would help with decorations, and how that attention had subtly shifted over the past few years, fading almost imperceptibly until tonight, when it became painfully obvious. I traced the rim of my glass with my fingers, noticing the slight condensation forming tiny droplets that ran slowly down the side, much like the gradual realization settling into my mind. Memories surfaced of past Christmases, of the warmth of family, of Robert reading stories to the children by the fire while I prepared dinner in the kitchen. I remembered Rachel joining in awkwardly, always trying to make herself indispensable, always with a hidden agenda that I had once overlooked. Now, the patterns were clear, the intentions unmistakable. I closed my eyes briefly, listening to the muffled conversation from the living room, allowing myself a moment to breathe, to gather my thoughts. Each detail of the evening, each glance, each small gesture was logged carefully in my mind. I thought about the gifts I had brought, the hours spent preparing each dish, and how the effort had been taken for granted, almost mocked. A quiet resolve began to form inside me, steady and unwavering, like the flame of a candle that refuses to be extinguished. I reminded myself that composure can be more powerful than confrontation, that observation can reveal truths hidden behind polite smiles and rehearsed words. From my vantage point at the window, I could see the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting on the freshly fallen snow, the world outside calm and serene, completely unaware of the undercurrents inside the house. I allowed myself to plan, in quiet increments, the ways I would respond, the subtle actions I could take to reclaim a measure of dignity and control, knowing that strength often manifests in silence and careful calculation. As the evening continued, I returned to the living room to place the empty plate back on the table, smiling faintly at Rachel as she talked with a cousin, her attention fully absorbed elsewhere. I remained calm, poised, attentive, storing each detail, each nuance, recognizing that understanding the pattern was the first step toward any meaningful change. And as the night drew on, the hum of conversation and laughter around me became a backdrop to my thoughts, each one reinforcing the knowledge that my quiet strength and patience would serve as my guide, and that the decisions I made in the coming days would be measured, deliberate, and unmistakably mine. As the evening wore on, I moved quietly to the side of the room, observing the interplay between Rachel and other family members. Every small gesture, every subtle laugh and tilt of her head spoke volumes, painting a picture of control and intention that I had ignored for too long. I could feel the warmth of the fireplace behind me, the glow softening the sharp lines of the room, yet it could not touch the chill creeping through my thoughts. I remembered the years of holiday gatherings I had organized, the care I took in setting tables, hanging lights, and choosing music that would make the house feel alive, and contrasted it with the polished, orchestrated interactions I was witnessing now. My hands rested lightly on the back of a chair, the smooth wood familiar and grounding, and I allowed myself to catalog each observation with precision. Wade laughed at a story Rachel told, a controlled laugh, and I noted the way he mirrored her tone, a subtle complicity that had not been there when he was a child. The children played near the tree, unaware of the tension that enveloped the adults, their soft giggles a reminder of the innocence that I once protected fiercely, teaching them traditions, baking cookies, and wrapping presents in the way Robert had loved. I felt the weight of past efforts juxtaposed with the present, the gradual erosion of attentiveness from those I trusted most. My thoughts traced back to conversations, invitations subtly declined, and occasions when my presence was minimized, small details that now formed a clear pattern. I remained calm, deliberately silent, letting the flow of the evening reveal more than any confrontation could. In my mind, I began mapping out the sequence of actions I would take, subtle yet deliberate, to restore balance and ensure that my contributions and presence would be recognized without the need for overt conflict. I noticed the way Rachel positioned herself in the center of the room, the way her gestures commanded attention, and how the relatives around her deferred in subtle, almost unconscious ways. I understood now that her power came from perception, and that by remaining composed, by observing, and by choosing carefully when and how to act, I could reclaim influence without raising alarms. I poured myself another glass of water, the cool liquid anchoring me to the present, and looked again at the snow falling outside, each flake moving at its own pace, untouched by the chaos inside. The room hummed with conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of gift wrap, but I felt a separation, a clarity that allowed me to focus on what mattered most. I returned to my seat with measured movements, taking a bite of the salad placed before me, noting flavors, textures, and the small effort behind each dish, appreciating the details even as the orchestrated social dynamics unfolded. Each observation was a note in a larger symphony of understanding, a map that would guide my next steps. I kept my expression neutral, watching, listening, remembering, and slowly, methodically, the sense of power and control returned to me, a quiet force ready to shape the outcomes of future gatherings, all while maintaining the composure and dignity that would ensure every action I took was deliberate and unmistakably mine. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. As guests began moving from the dining room to the living room, I felt a small hand slip into mine. It was my granddaughter, Sophie. She was 10 years old, with bright blue eyes and a habit of noticing things adults preferred to ignore. She looked up at me quietly and asked if I wanted to see the ornament she had made at school. I smiled and followed her toward the Christmas tree. For the first time all evening, the tightness in my chest eased slightly. She pointed proudly at a handmade ornament hanging near the center of the tree. It was simple, made from painted wood and glitter, but she had written something on the back. When she handed it to me, I turned it over and read the words carefully. Best grandma ever. My throat tightened, not from sadness this time, but from the reminder that not everyone in the room saw me through Rachel's eyes. Sophie leaned closer and whispered that she had missed spending time with me. She said she loved the Christmas cookies I used to make every year, and asked why I had not invited her over recently. The question caught me off guard. I had invited her. Several times. I remembered calling Wade and leaving messages. I remembered sending cards and asking about weekends that might work. Each time there had been an excuse. School activities, busy schedules, family plans. Standing there beside the tree, I suddenly realized those explanations might not have come from Wade alone. Sophie continued talking, completely unaware of the thoughts racing through my mind. She mentioned a few family events that had happened during the year, gatherings I had never heard about, a lake weekend during the summer, a birthday dinner for a cousin, a neighborhood barbecue. She spoke innocently, assuming I knew all about them. I nodded politely while a different picture began forming in my mind. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. This was not one awkward holiday moment. This had been happening for a long time. Slowly, quietly, deliberately. Someone had been reducing my presence in the family one event at a time. I glanced across the room. Rachel was standing near the fireplace, speaking with relatives. Her posture was confident, comfortable, like someone completely certain of her position. Then I noticed something else. Every conversation somehow seemed to orbit around her. Every plan, every future event, every family decision. She was at the center of all of it. Years ago, that role belonged to Robert and me. Not because we demanded attention, but because people naturally gathered around us. We hosted holidays. We remembered birthdays. We brought people together. After Robert passed away, I had assumed life simply changed. Now I wondered if someone had helped accelerate that change. Sophie hugged me before running off to join the other children. I stood beside the tree holding the ornament in my hand. The lights reflected across its glittered surface, creating tiny flashes of color. For a moment, I felt grateful for her honesty. Children often reveal truths without realizing it. While adults hide behind politeness, children simply speak. And what Sophie had unknowingly revealed was more valuable than she could imagine. I was no longer looking at isolated incidents. I was seeing a strategy, a slow campaign of exclusion disguised as scheduling conflicts and misunderstandings. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me calm. Because once you finally understand the game being played around you, you stop reacting emotionally. You start paying attention. And as I looked across the room at Rachel laughing comfortably among relatives, I realized she believed the process was complete. She believed I had become invisible. What she did not realize was that invisible people often see the most. When the evening finally began winding down, coats started appearing from closets and guests slowly gathered their belongings. The children looked sleepy. The adults exchanged hugs and promises to meet again soon. I stood near the entryway, smiling politely, thanking everyone for coming, behaving exactly as they expected me to behave. Quiet, gracious, harmless. Yet my mind was more alert than it had been in years. As relatives filtered toward the front door, I noticed something interesting. Several of them barely spoke to me directly. Instead, they thanked Rachel for the evening, complimented Rachel on the decorations, and asked Rachel about future plans. It was subtle, but impossible to miss once I started looking for it. Somehow, over time, she had positioned herself as the gatekeeper of the family. Information flowed through her. Invitations flowed through her. Relationships flowed through her. The realization sat heavily in my thoughts. For years, I had assumed distance happened naturally after Robert passed away. Children grow up. Families change. Life becomes busy. That explanation had comforted me because it was easier than asking difficult questions. Now I was no longer certain. As I reached for my coat, I overheard part of a conversation coming from the hallway. Rachel was speaking to one of her friends who had stopped by briefly to deliver a gift basket. Neither woman realized I was nearby. It took a while, Rachel said with a quiet laugh. But things are finally simpler now. Her friend smiled. You always said you wanted fewer complications. Rachel nodded. Exactly. Some people do not know when to step aside. The words were not directed at me directly. My name was never mentioned. But I felt them land all the same. I remained silent. A younger version of myself might have confronted her immediately. I might have demanded an explanation or forced an uncomfortable conversation. Instead, I simply listened. People often reveal far more when they believe nobody is paying attention. The drive home took about 30 minutes. Snow continued falling steadily as I followed the familiar roads back to my neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed from rooftops and front porches. Families gathered inside warm homes while holiday music drifted faintly from passing cars. Normally, I love these quiet drives. Tonight, I spent the entire trip replaying conversations. Not just from this evening, but from the past several years. Patterns appeared everywhere. Small moments I had dismissed. Events I had missed. Invitations that somehow never reached me. Information that arrived after decisions had already been made. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Certainty. My house greeted me with silence. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The scent of pine from my own Christmas tree lingered in the air. The living room looked exactly as I had left it that morning. Neat, warm, peaceful. I placed my purse on the table and sat down in Robert's favorite armchair. The clock on the wall ticked softly. For several minutes, I simply sat there, thinking, remembering, understanding. Then I stood and walked toward a small cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside were old photo albums, holiday cards, notebooks, and family records I had carefully saved over the years. I opened the cabinet slowly, not because I was searching for memories. I was searching for answers. If I wanted to understand how things had changed, I needed to stop relying on feelings and start looking at facts. Dates, messages, invitations, conversations, evidence. Rachel believed I was fading into the background. She believed I would quietly accept whatever role she assigned me. As I opened the first album and began turning pages beneath the glow of the Christmas tree, I realized something important. The truth leaves traces. And for the first time, I was ready to follow every one of them. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood settling against the winter cold. I made a cup of coffee and carried it into the living room where the Christmas tree still glowed softly in the dim light. The photo albums remained exactly where I had left them the night before. One by one, I continued turning pages. At first, I was only looking for memories. Then I began noticing something else. Dates, patterns, missing pieces. There were dozens of photographs from family gatherings I had organized over the years. Birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, summer cookouts. Yet as the years progressed, I noticed fewer invitations with my handwriting on them and more events arranged by Rachel. That alone meant nothing. Families evolve. Responsibilities shift. But what caught my attention was how often I appeared to learn about those events after they happened. I reached for an old notebook where I had always written reminders, birthdays, and holiday plans. The entries stretched back nearly 10 years. Several pages contained notes beside family events. Call Wade next week. Ask about barbecue date. Waiting for details. Never received information. Reading those simple notes sent a chill through me. At the time, each incident felt isolated. Looking at them together created a very different picture. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my sister, Carol. We spoke every few weeks, though our conversations had become less frequent recently. After exchanging holiday greetings, she hesitated. The pause was unusual enough that I noticed immediately. Finally, she asked if I was doing all right. I told her I was fine. Then she became quiet again. Emily, she said carefully, there is something I have wondered about for a long time. I leaned back in my chair. What is it? Another pause followed. Why did you stop coming to family gatherings? I stared at the wall across from me. What gatherings? The silence on the other end seemed to stretch forever. Carol sounded genuinely confused. She mentioned several events from the past 2 years. A spring picnic. A 4th of July celebration. A family brunch after Sophie won an academic award. She assumed I had chosen not to attend. My stomach tightened. Nobody had ever invited me. Carol slowly explained that Rachel often told relatives I was tired, busy, traveling, or simply preferred staying home. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed something much larger. I thanked Carol for her honesty and ended the call shortly afterward. Then I sat quietly for several minutes. Not angry, not shocked, just certain. The final pieces were sliding into place. Rachel had not merely stepped into a leadership role within the family. She had become the narrator. She controlled information. She controlled perception. Most importantly, she controlled the story people believed about me. Once that realization settled in, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For years, I wondered whether I had become forgettable. Whether age had slowly pushed me to the edge of my own family. Whether loneliness was simply part of growing older. Now I understood something different. This had never been about age. It had been about influence. Someone had quietly rewritten my role while I remained busy grieving Robert and trying to preserve peace. I stood and walked toward the window. Snow covered the neighborhood in a blanket of white. Everything looked calm and untouched. Yet beneath that surface, every driveway, sidewalk, and lawn remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden, not erased. I smiled faintly at the thought. Because the truth works the same way. It can be covered for a while, but it never disappears. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I knew exactly where I needed to begin. By late afternoon, the house was quiet again. I moved to the kitchen to tidy up a few dishes, every movement deliberate, measured, and calm. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine from the evening earlier, the remnants of roasted turkey and spiced cider lingering in the air. I opened a drawer to straighten the cutlery and noticed the subtle reflection of the tree lights on the polished countertop, dancing softly in a way that felt almost meditative. Sitting down at the small kitchen table, I pulled out a notepad and began jotting observations. Every detail from the evening replayed in my mind. The way Rachel controlled conversations, the subtle deflection of attention away from me, the timing of glances shared with relatives, all of it now clearly intentional. I wrote each event with precision, mapping patterns and sequences, connecting small moments across weeks and months, building a clear picture of influence and control. I remembered the letters and invitations that never arrived, the calls that went unanswered, the casual excuses, the overlooked contributions. Each forgotten or ignored action had been a deliberate stroke in a much larger picture. I smiled faintly to myself, a quiet acknowledgement of the clarity I had gained. The house outside was beginning to darken, the light dimming as snow continued to settle over the neighborhood. I could see rooftops dusted with white and the soft glow of street lamps reflecting on the freshly fallen snow. It was peaceful, yet the tranquility of the evening did not diminish the understanding that had settled within me. I traced my finger along the rim of the cup of tea I had prepared, the warmth of comfort as my mind shifted toward planning. Not confrontation, not a public display, but small, deliberate actions designed to reveal the truth and restore balance. I considered the upcoming gatherings, the way Rachel would likely attempt to orchestrate perception again. I thought about the subtle influence she wielded and the methods I could employ to quietly assert presence and awareness. Composure was essential. Timing was critical. Patience would be my ally. Every gesture, every careful observation, every note I had made would inform the approach I intended to take. The light from the tree cast soft shadows across the floor, and I realized that in the quiet of my own home, clarity could flourish. I allowed myself a deep breath, letting the sense of empowerment grow slowly, carefully. This was the beginning of a strategy grounded in understanding, observation, and a quiet assertion of dignity. I knew that the days to come would require continued attentiveness, but also subtle action, actions that would ensure the balance of respect and recognition would eventually return to its rightful place. Sitting there, pen in hand, the snow falling silently outside, I felt the first real sense of control I had experienced in months, a steady, unshakable knowledge that the story of my family was still, ultimately, mine to understand. And influence. 3 days later, I took the first step. Not a dramatic step, not a confrontation, just a simple phone call. I invited several relatives to lunch at a small restaurant that Robert and I had loved for years. Nothing formal, nothing unusual. To my surprise, every single person accepted. That alone told me something important. The distance I had been feeling was not coming from them as much as I had believed. When Saturday arrived, I drove across town beneath clear winter skies and arrived 15 minutes early. The restaurant smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread. Sunlight streamed through large windows, reflecting off polished wood tables. One by one, my relatives arrived. My cousin Linda, my nephew Mark, my sister Carol, even 2 relatives I had not spoken with in nearly a year. The conversation started casually. Holiday plans, family stories, memories of Robert. Then something interesting happened. Without prompting, several people began mentioning events I supposedly declined to attend. A birthday party, a summer picnic, a graduation celebration. Each story sounded familiar, not because I had attended, but because I had never been told about them. I listened carefully. I asked simple questions. Nothing more. Who organized it? When was the invitation sent? How did everyone receive the details? The answers were remarkably consistent. Rachel had handled everything. Rachel had told people I was busy. Rachel had explained that I preferred smaller gatherings. Rachel had assured everyone I sent my best wishes. Nobody questioned it because it sounded reasonable. Why would they? I smiled gently and stirred my coffee. For the first time, I realized that most of these people had never intended to exclude me. They had simply been given a version of reality that benefited someone else. The lunch lasted nearly 3 hours. By the end, several relatives seemed confused. Others appeared uncomfortable. Not because I accused anyone. I never did. The facts spoke for themselves. As we prepared to leave, Carol touched my arm. Her expression carried a mixture of regret and concern. She apologized for not noticing sooner. I squeezed her hand and told her there was nothing to apologize for. Some truths take time to surface. That evening, I returned home feeling lighter than I had in months. The loneliness that had followed me since Robert passed away no longer felt permanent. It felt manufactured, and manufactured things can be dismantled. I sat beside the Christmas tree once more and looked at the ornaments Sophie had given me. Best grandma ever. The glitter sparkled beneath the lights. I smiled. For weeks, I had been looking backward, trying to understand what happened. Now I was looking forward. The balance of the family had already begun to shift. Not because I forced it, not because I demanded it, simply because the truth had started finding its way into the open. Across town, Rachel probably believed everything remained exactly as she had arranged it. She probably thought Christmas dinner had accomplished its purpose. What she did not know was that people were beginning to compare stories. Questions were beginning to form. Doubts were beginning to appear. And once people start asking questions, control becomes much harder to maintain. I turned off the tree lights and stood quietly in the darkness for a moment. The house felt different now. Not emptier. Stronger. Because for the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to someone else's version of my life. I was preparing to reclaim my own.